Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest Michael Shellenberger. Michael is the founder of Environmental Progress and the author of the best-selling Apocalypse Never and most recently San Fransicko, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. Michael, welcome back. It's great to have you.
It's great to see you again, brother.
So, today I'm wanting to focus on the energy crisis, which is really capturing so much of the news and I think such a hot topic and so relevant to nuclear advocacy. Very excited to talk about, this maybe it's a decadal potential for a nuclear renaissance. We were talking about similar things in the early 2000s. Well, I wasn't on board yet. And I'm interested in talking about, some of the pitfalls that lie ahead and ways to avoid that. And I think I've been very much convinced by your analysis, and I'm hoping to get some more of that. But first, you just published San Fransicko. It's come out to pretty rave reviews. You were on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think that's kind of the ultimate marker of success in this day and age. I listened to it. It was a great interview. I'm curious, though, how your book has been received, particularly amongst progressives who I think you're arguing are ruining lives and cities with this kind of misguided misapplication of the lessons of Europe's, successful drug policy. So maybe I'll give you a chance to kind of give me the elevator pitch on that. Let's take it away.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Great to be back, brother. It's been an exciting few weeks. I've been traveling every week since the book came out. It came out 3 weeks ago tomorrow. Amazon bestseller. Don't know if we're going to make the bestseller list of the New York Times. It is selling well. Joe Rogan is sort of like winning the lottery or something, or getting the gold coupon in the Willy Wonka chocolate.
I actually wrote him when I first discovered your work, and I was like, you have to have this guy on. I mean, that was
that's
two
really
and a half
nice.
years ago. Yeah, for sure.
There have been a fair number of people over the years who were like, hey, Mike, I got this idea for you, man. You should go on the Joe Rogan experience. They're like, that's what you should do. And I'm kind of like, yeah, because I'll just call him up and make that happen. It's like, I don't think people know quite how, but I took it as a compliment, and obviously it was exciting to meet him. And he's a very impressive person. He's not, he cultivates the everyman and I'm just a dummy kind of thing. But the genius of that and the genius of this medium is, first of all, his stamina. I was tired after 3 hours, man. So that's not nothing to, and he always has something to ask. And we ran out of time. It's like, you're like 3 hours. What could you possibly talk about? You're like, yeah, it's actually not enough time.
Totally.
So, but
totally.
It was fun.
Yeah. No, it demonstrates a certain depth. If you can do 3 hours, it means you've thought a lot about the topics. In terms of drug policy, it's something that's, of great interest to me as a medical doctor, who, during my training, I was being taught by very compassionate pain specialists, and being fed the sort of Purdue pharmaceutical propaganda that, opioids are safe. Again, this was based on not a study, but a paragraph long letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine, that there was a low addiction risk and, a very different environment than that of, what became the opioid epidemic, with these huge prescriptions for the highly addictive OxyContin. When I have a patient who's addicted to fentanyl, I always ask them, what was your first exposure to opioids? And almost without exception, it's, they got a ridiculously huge prescription, 60 tablets of OxyContin for a shoulder injury. So I have a huge amount of compassion for opioid users. A lot of them are, admitted to hospital for various serious illnesses and don't actually get the appropriate doses, and they leave. And, so it's something I take very seriously. I think, through your storytelling in the book, it's kind of very intimate. You spend a lot of time with folks addicted to these kind of hungry ghost drugs and their families. Tell me a little bit about, the emotional impact of that on you.
Oh, you're very sweet to ask that question. You're the first person that's asked me that question outside of my immediate family. Yeah, I mean, I was actually really, really reluctant to admit that I experienced. I still don't want to use I still don't really agree with the word for it, but basically, my sister and my wife were like, they were like, you've experienced secondary trauma. And I was like, come on. I was like, because it's like the people that I actually interviewed experienced secondary. Some of my best sources, including the people that were ethnographers with street addicts, they suffer secondary trauma. Not me. That was what I told myself. But yeah, I was affected by this research. I mean, I was. It's just darn sad, dude. Like it's very sad. It's very discouraging. It's in some ways the opposite book to Apocalypse Never. And in fact, some of the reaction has been more contrary than I thought. In other words, Apocalypse Never is an optimistic book that was reacted to with great anger and emotion. Anger, really. San Fransicko is a much darker book, and it's a much, in some ways, I mean, not in some ways, it was a more difficult book to write for me, both emotionally and intellectually. And I think it's harder to read. It takes people longer to read. And yeah, it did have an impact on me. Trauma's such a grossly overused word, and it's a word whose overuse I criticize in San Fransicko, where I argue that we need to be tougher, basically, and be more stoic, and stop being like, I have some pain and I need an opioid. That's a big part of what runs through the book. It's a criticism of coddling culture. But yeah, I mean, what's happening is absolutely immoral. What's the non-treatment or the ill treatment of the mentally ill and addicted, some of whom are the same people. It's happening not just in the United States, but it's interesting. It's happening. I actually at one point said we had it the worst in the United States, and somebody corrected me, and they were correct to do so. Which is Scotland has the worst drug epidemic, even all these years after train spotting. Yeah. But Toronto, I don't know. I've heard Toronto's not great. Vancouver is famously as bad as Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles.
It's a West Coast phenomenon,
the focus
right?
of the book. So yeah. But yeah, man, thank you for asking that. And I actually really had not recovered from, again, to use the therapeutic language, I had not really recovered from it until Helen and I went to Europe this summer, or actually in the late fall, and really just didn't work. It was like really 2 weeks of deliberate not working.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a real strength, especially among nuclear advocates, to have other causes as well. I think it brings a lot of credibility, and it demonstrates that overarching humanism. So I commend you for taking on another issue. It's I feel that way in terms of medical triage, right? You look at the problems in the world around you, you look at what your internal resources are, how you can best apply them. So much respect for that. I mean, for folks interested in the book, do go over to the Joe Rogan show. It's 3 hours, but it passes very quickly. And I think we'll leave San Fransicko there, because we only have another 47 minutes, which I'm very conscious of. And there's so much I want to explore with you, Michael. And maybe if you're gracious enough, I'll try and take another bit of time in your busy schedule. So, I mean, you're not afraid of heterodox opinions, and there's a kind of like principled consistency that I see in your work. I don't agree with everything that you say, but I think you're a pretty fascinating thinker. You've expanded the Overton window. I think as a nuclear pioneer, you've made it more and more acceptable and safe for this next generation of activists and really this movement to start blossoming. And those heterodox opinions span nuclear, renewables, climate, drug policy, as we were just talking about. I guess very briefly, what's the sort of consequences that you've held, for having these opinions? I think there's been some degree of kind of cancel culture that's applied to you. I don't want to ask you another sort of how does that make you feel thing, but I think like what makes you like principled in this way that you're not afraid to take shit and to hold a position that is consistent. Like there's a lot of kind of, honey attracts more flies than vinegar. So like kiss the ring of renewables in order to promote nuclear. Maybe we'll focus on that, like your take on renewables and that kind of consistency. What drives that? I don't know. Maybe it's a personality feature. I'm not sure.
Yes, for sure. It's definitely personality. I couldn't do anything other than be as honest as I've been about these topics. I just don't, I'm not psychologically healthy if I have to shade the truth, even, which includes not talking about certain things or saying things in ways that would allow them to be misunderstood. I just can't sleep with that. I literally am depressed if I have to do that, and I end up quitting whatever I'm engaged in if I have to do that. And that's happened several times throughout my life, where I've had to leave institutions because of that. So in some ways, on the one hand, I do take pride in my honesty, but yeah, it means that it hasn't been an obvious or easy career or life for myself. When I started Environmental Progress, many people may know this, certainly people in the pro-nuclear movement may know this, I just had a lot more donors and they gave a lot more money. And right away, I started, basically reporting things in my reporting about nuclear and about renewables that were politically incorrect among nuclear people. So again, we're talking about me being a heretic among heretics. It's not that I'm pro-nuclear. It was that I was saying things that were really against the nuclear community's orthodoxy. And by nuclear community, I don't really mean the industry so much as the nuclear scientific and technical and advocacy community. And those things, if I had to boil them down, were don't talk bad about renewables, hype futuristic technologies, and pretend there's no real relationship between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. I refused to do all three, and right away it became clear, 1 year after starting Environmental Progress, that my donors were not on board with me doing that. And so we lost a significant amount of funding from 2017 really through to last year. We lost our last major donor, not our last major donor. We lost a major donor last year. We haven't lost any major donors since.
Right.
And, as soon as it started happening in 2017, there wasn't really any question of what I was going to do, which was basically be in a race to get to the bottom of what is going on with nuclear in particular, but sure, energy and the environment more broadly. And that meant that all of our resources, we basically had to both try to build a pro-nuclear movement at the same time that we had to do what I think of as the most cutting edge on nuclear energy, most cutting edge research on nuclear energy that anybody's done since the publication of the histories by the Atomic Energy Commission. And that turned into Apocalypse Never, and now it's the subject of my next book on nuclear.
And I understand part of that was to compile a list of every nuclear plant in the world, and go country by country and look at which ones were threatened, and then again apply triage to go and save nuclear plants. I think, I think this whole sort of carbon offset thing is pretty silly, and carbon footprint stuff is pretty silly, but because it's individual and what's needed is collective action. But my efforts to save this 3,200 megawatt nuclear plant near me will result in me being able to take I think 10 million flights across the Atlantic every year in terms of that carbon offset.
Good one.
But in terms of this kind of factionalism within nuclear advocacy, I think there is a temptation for a sort of like, why can't we all just get along? What about bothism sort of thing? And again, not to always go back to triage, but we do have limited resources in terms of our energy as advocates, but also in terms of what the nuclear industry ends up doing. So I've kind of come up with a few factions. I think there's kind of woke nuclear, which kind of applies identity politics, a bit of virtue signaling, kind of an environmental justice approach, which I find a bit bizarre because nuclear is so environmentally just in terms of the clean air benefits and the good union jobs. There's certainly climate nuclear. I think I'm certainly a part of that in terms of like the fantasy, hopefully coming true of a kind of global mesmer plan, state intervention to make stuff happen, be like France. There's obviously the advanced nuclear crowd that drive me a little nuts. Bill Gates's book, How to Avert a Climate Catastrophe. He's hyping new technologies. He's trying to get this natrium plant built, which is interesting, but says nothing about existing nuclear. And with Diablo closing, we need to build, I think, 7 natriums. And how long is that going to take? Do we even know if they're going to work? There's kind of industry nuclear, which is very weak on defending existing nuclear, almost
Right.
exclusively pinning their hopes on, novel designs. And then I guess there's kind of right-wing nuclear, folks like Alex Epstein, for instance. So there's like quite a ecosystem. I do feel like it's important that, we don't all sort of toe the company line and that there is a sort of diversity of opinion. But I think particularly in regards to, what you were mentioning before, speaking critically about renewables, but also, figuring out how to engage with SMR and advanced nuclear, which really is kind of hegemonic in a lot of ways. I'd like to hear your thoughts a bit more on that. I've quoted you recently as saying, innovation in nuclear is the product of demand for existing nuclear. But maybe you can flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah. I love your taxonomy. I would I love it. No, seriously, I haven't heard it before. I love it. I would say woke nuclear and EJ nuclear is the same. I would say I would call, just because I think Alex Epstein's a libertarian, I would say that's libertarian nuclear, not right-wing nuclear.
Okay.
But I like that taxonomy a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think for your listeners may already know my view. My view is that I guess I'm more on the I like Alex Epstein. So there's parts of his story that I agree with because I'm pro-gas, for example, pro-natural gas replacing coal. But I guess I'm probably in the climate, nuclear, and statism. But I'm a lukewarmer on climate, not a climate alarmist. But I do think that basically the French model is the right one. And I don't even think it's the French model. I think it's everybody's model, which is basically large regulated utilities using very low cost capital, particularly it can be public capital or it can be pension fund capital, which at that point, when it's people's retirement savings, it's got to be super safe. That means you're de-risking the nuclear construction. That means that you're going with experienced crews who are building the exact same nuclear plants that they built before. The closer you can get to that as the model, experienced crews building the exact same plant they built before, the closer you get to that, the lower your costs are going to be. And that comes before, whether it's a pressurized water reactor, a Canadian nuclear reactor known as a CANDU, or a Japanese advanced boiling water reactor, which actually is a perfectly fine design, and especially when built by the Japanese guys that had been building them. Or my favorite, the South Korean APR 1400, which is a very large nuclear reactor. 1400 means it's 40% more power than a traditional typical 1,000 megawatt reactor, and that does not come with a corresponding 40% increase either in construction or operations crew. So you're talking about a significant savings for ratepayers, for the loan guarantors or loan givers, and for the utilities. So for me, I am all about boring nuclear. I want boring nuclear. I want cheap nuclear. I want safe nuclear. I want experienced nuclear. It's all about human factors. Now, you can see that runs me right up against money, power, and religion within the nuclear community. So let's start with the obvious one, money. There's no money to be made by by many nuclear utilities in just saving the plants they have. They don't. That's the work of a couple of their nuclear PR people, but that's not something that gets $1 million to build a movement or something.
There's so much money in decommissioning as well.
Yes, there's that too. I mean, that's not even getting into decommissioning. But if you just kind of go, does the industry properly fund activity to save its existing nuclear? The answer is no, because it doesn't have any money to do that. The money on the nuclear advocacy side is from Bill Gates and people like that who have dreams of making a lot of money building new reactors. The other issue is power. I mean, I think that the love of these futuristic designs gives people like Bill Gates and engineers a kind of social and political power. They get meetings with senators, they testify, they get big grants from U.S. government and other governments to test reactors. They know more than everybody else in the room whenever they're talking about why, my particular lithium fluoride beryllium coolant combined with thorium is superior to the traditional water uranium coolant, and why you need fast neutrons, not slow neutrons. It goes over. Nobody understands what that means outside of nuclear, and so it gives them some social and political capital, as we'd call it. And then religion, which is, I just think, On two levels. The first is that the dominant emotional negative reaction to nuclear stems from fear of the bomb and fear of apocalypse. And so when you're selling something that is apocalypse free, you're actually pushing back against a religion and constructing a new one. And the new one is my magic box will save the world twice, once from climate change and the second time from nuclear proliferation. And that is what the Gates sell has been. It's totally dishonest. It's absolutely manipulative of emotions, of people's goodwill. But nonetheless, it's the dominant strategy of pro-nuclear people. And I push back against it. And yeah, I paid a price, but it's worth it because the truth is just so much more goddamn interesting than the fantasy story sold by advanced nuclear advocates.
So let me run something by you. I just tweeted about this today, but I had a meeting with someone high level at Natural Resources Canada, and she explained to me the sort of three-prong approach of the Canadian nuclear establishment. And this is very much the managerial class, not the workers and their unions, who I think have a much better grasp of the actual technicalities. So our plan is a decarbonization effort by building first-of-a-kind SMRs, maybe advanced. We're not sure yet. It hasn't been selected for the Darlington site. We're shutting down 3,200 megawatts at Pickering and not refurbishing it, despite it having been approved by the Nuclear Safety Commission, and then building a 300 meg. So we're losing 10 times for 1x essentially of power. The second one is micro-modular reactors for the north to replace diesel in northern communities. Like a cool idea, but maybe we're taking on a little much here as a country that hasn't built anything new in something like 25 years. And then we're going for a third design in the tiny province of New Brunswick. And this is because the people of New Brunswick have been surveyed. They're terrified of nuclear waste. So we need like a burner breeder fast reactor there. Again, maybe Russia's doing this at pretty high expense. France failed at it. Big nuclear countries, right? But we're going to do it in this tiny little province. And it drives me completely insane. So this fixation on, how a new design is going to save us. When I look at the sort of early renaissance of the early 2000s, it was very much, again, in new designs. The AP1000 is modular. It's going to just snap together like Lego. The EPR, the core catcher, 2 steel line bits of containment, 4 safety trains. I mean, these things are not unbuildable, but as we've seen, hugely overpriced and over budget. And I like what you're saying about the APR 1400. Not to get too technical with all these names. I think my listeners are pretty nerdy, and so we'll know them. But,
yeah, they'll love it. They'll love it.
what did Korea did? They were humble, right? They were saying, listen, at the early stages, we're not sure how to build these things. Let's find the best people, the best design, and invite them in. And I think that maybe the West is just too hubristic. We can't say, hey, we suck at this anymore. Let's bring the Koreans over as consultants. Let's bring some, Chinese crane operators in, et cetera. So I don't know. I guess it's not really a question, but more a commentary. But I'm deeply concerned that we're gonna fuck up this historic opportunity for a nuclear renaissance, with the industry's own shot in the foot with their own little handgun to sort of paint a metaphor there.
You're preach, Chris. Amen to all that. I totally agree with you. You're obviously right. When you say that to the smart members of Congress, and there are some, they go, yeah, this is nuts. I did this with the leading up and coming, Republican in the House. And he was just like, I was like, does this sound as nuts as it? I added the part about how we're letting China go ahead and take over Saudi Arabia's nuclear program. I was like, do you see any downside to that? Maybe does any of that seem off to you? What about just turning Africa over to Russia and China? Does that not seem, in terms of building new nuclear plants, does that not seem like a problem? He was like, this is nuts. I can't find anybody that's like, no, I think it's great. I mean, John Kerry, that's what he believes, but he won't come out and say it. They literally, the anti-nuclear progressives literally think that if they go, what they really want to say, but they won't say it, is they want to say, it's good that the West is withdrawing from nuclear. Eventually the Russians and Chinese will see that they should do the same thing too. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what they actually think. And it's as opposed to and that's, I think, where it comes to the weapons stuff, which is it's not just that this is bad for climate. In fact, it's worse on a national security level. Now, with the energy crisis, that's obvious now. I mean, it's obvious now that like we didn't have enough nuclear, right? It's kind of like Mark Linus and George Monbiot in 2015 attacked the idea of building new nuclear in Britain. Those are two people who are maybe the most famous pro-nuclear people in Britain. This self-destructiveness.
I didn't believe it when I saw that link in your. I had to click on the link and see the article.
Yeah.
It was pretty shocking.
Yeah,
but it's that kind of sucking up, right?
Well, yeah, but also like, I mean, look, if I'm gonna defend Mark and George, I would say, hey, at the time they were saying Hinkley Point C, which is the new nuclear plant they were criticizing, will cost £92 a megawatt hour. That's the strike point. That was the point that they agreed to. That seemed high at the time. Gas was abundant. Wind was blowing. So I think, to be fair to them, hopefully they'll change. It'd be worth you asking them, certainly asking Mark. I bet he'd come on the show and talk about it. That now I think is obviously short-sighted. Like obviously it is because we're now in electricity shortages globally and countries are returning to coal. So just forget the cost perspective, just from an environmental perspective. So self-described climate alarmists, or like at least ostensibly climate alarmist people like Mark Linus ought to be apologizing and retracting his opposition to Hinkley Point C. If he doesn't, then he's a complete hypocrite because the world is moving to coal. Britain is starting up, is burning more coal, because we didn't build enough nuclear. And that should be obvious to everybody right now. I haven't seen anybody other than you and Robert Bryce and Alex Epstein, and Emmett Penny and Mark Nelson, kind of just come out and say that. But for the most part, the rest of the nuclear community has been like, well, this is more reason we need a mix of renewables and flexible, small, non-water-based reactors that don't exist. It's like, come on, guys, seriously? Like, seriously, we could have been building a bunch of big, old, boring, light water reactors over the last 10 years, 20 years, that would be available to us in the midst of the worst energy crisis in 50 years, and you're going to keep up with that whole mixology bullshit? It's like, come on.
It's been said many times that, building a electricity system or an energy system even, right? Because it's beyond electricity in terms of, according to Mark C. Jacobson, right? That building that system dependent on weather in a time of climate change and a change in weather patterns is quite foolish. And it's very interesting, this global stilling, as it's being called, or wind droughts, and that's what's affecting Europe right now. That has just massive implications. So it's very bizarre because, I'm going to COP26 soon, and we're in the middle of this energy crisis, and it's more complex than just, environmental activists who killed nuclear, went all in on renewables and encouraged the divestment from fossil fuels, which is ironically leading to coal burning now. But that's pretty potent.
I don't know. That's pretty darn accurate. In my view, that's a pretty darn accurate summation of it. I mean, you kind of go, okay, there's other factors. Like there was a drought in Brazil that led to less hydro. There was less water out of the Norway dams, Sweden. There was a wind drought. And then there's post-COVID pandemic catch-up. But the bottom line is we don't have enough reliable electricity, either in the form of nuclear or natural gas, and that's why they're burning coal. So you can kind of be like, oh, there's just, supply short changes, but actually no, there's underlying lack of supply, and you can't blame that on 18 months of COVID.
And it's interesting how it's shifted the conversation. All of a sudden you have, Boris Johnson and Macron at least warming up to nuclear. I think Macron's still sort of we have to reinvent nuclear. We'll do a bunch of SMRs. Although I think there's talk of doing 6, unfortunately, great big, complex, expensive EPRs rather than I think what you and I advocate, or what I've kind of learned from your advocacy. Let's be real. But, the other challenge, I think, to this nuclear renaissance, as you were mentioning, is, deregulation, free marketeering. And I'm curious because, the political right seems to like nuclear as well. You were framing it more as a kind of libertarian impulse. But I can't think of an example around the world where, a large nuclear buildout has occurred on those libertarian principles. It seems like bizarre that the political right would support nuclear because of the need for strong government support, regulated markets, etc. So, what is the motivation for the political right, and do countries that fall under that political spectrum, do they have a chance to do, I think, what we advocate for, which is whatever, France-like build out?
Yeah, I mean, look, conservatives, libertarians, Republicans, they don't just view every issue through the lens of the market. That's a bit of a caricature, I think, or that's a misperception by people, by progressives who don't take the time to actually understand how those folks reason about these issues. Nuclear energy is in the category of national security for people that are right of center, overwhelmingly. It's first and foremost the core to making us safe in terms of having a nuclear shield that protects us and our families. Secondarily, it's an issue of energy security in the form of national security. And here's where these two things are related, in that, it's a national security need for a nation to be able to produce its own energy. This is not well understood. And sometimes, professional managerial class people will go to like island nations, or they'll go to Hawaii and I'll go, there's places that just import their energy and it's fine. It's like not the United States, not Germany, not France, not Britain, not any country that wants to be a country, an actual country that's capable of being sort of autonomous in the world. They don't know. You have to have security of supply. And for a long time in the United States, that just meant coal and nuclear. But when we became big oil and gas producers, then that shifted. And so, but the idea that, so for Republicans, that's the main event. Now, you mentioned Macron. For me, much more important than Macron's, public relations spin around soft modular, because that's just PR. That's just the political, I know them all. I mean, I know most of them. It's like the professional political advisors and public relations people in the nuclear industry do polling and focus groups, and they find that when you tell people that we're just going to have little bitty nuclear reactors that don't exist and are perfectly safe and never melt down, and that they will accompany the transition to renewables, that's more popular with people that don't know anything than the view that you and I hold. And so, yeah, if nobody knows anything, of course, that just sounds good, because it sounds like they're just getting a little bit of nuclear and we're still going to do renewables, which they think are good for the environment, which they're not. So, I thought more significant was you saw Macron do something that I had never seen anybody do for, I think, I want to say 60 years, which is they created this little video he showed on Twitter called La Rêve est possible, which is the dream is possible. And it is an absolutely extraordinary little Twitter video. Everybody should see it. I watched it 6 times. And the 6th time I was like, I could watch that another 6 times. I mean, it has archival video of Marie Curie. It ties nuclear. It starts with nuclear. And then it ties nuclear to the greatness, or what is famously known as the radiance of France, which is its technological sophistication. They even show, I was watching it with my wife, and we were like, they even showed the Concorde. In other words, here's this jet that supposedly is this failure, but the French are like, who cares? That's a much more Silicon Valley view of these things. It's like, the Concorde, it failed, but it is still a great jet. It's like you could see, but they tied it to heart transplants, genetic engineering, DNA, understanding the DNA. I mean, so radiation, this is this whole other thing. You've done your bit on this too, and you know it because of medical. But I mean, radiation is this gift. It's this incredible gift to understand how the body works, how nature works. And what he did is he tied nuclear into the proper vision of it. Which you watch that video and you're like, is that a right-wing video? I don't think so. Is it a left-wing video? No, I don't see how it's a left-wing video either exactly. It's just nuclear. It is what nuclear wants to be. So Macron is the first person to produce, other than, Robert Stone, obviously, and Frankie Fenton is doing the same thing. But in terms of a head of state producing propaganda that is both accurate, inspiring, and honest, and true to what nuclear truly is, and not this bad green fantasy or this bad small fantasy of small people like Bill Gates. I thought that was a watershed in the pro-nuclear movement.
Yeah, it's an incredible video, quite the eco-modernist video. It's celebrating innovation. This is not a degrowth video. It really bucks against that trend. And I've been thinking a lot about innovation and a lot about the catastrophists, the people scaring the shit out of little children, with a message that's really hopeless, doomy. Tune in, drop out. And my impulse is we need, the same kind of energy that was around the Sputnik anxiety with massive, investments in education to produce the people that are going to solve the problems of climate. We know we're heading to 2 or 3 degrees. That we have different opinions, I think, on how serious that is, but certainly we're going to need, gene editing to adapt crops to drought and more saline soils, et cetera. And if we fail to innovate, some of these, catastrophist predictions may come true. We may have big food stresses and food shocks, or even what's coming true right now in terms of basically, Mark Nelson says that this wasn't an energy transition. It was a kind of degrowth transition. And we're seeing that affecting, fertilizer production, which may very well result in food shortages. And you have, sorry, for the word here, but you have assholes like, I think the guy's last name is Tooze, who just published an article basically praising the energy crisis and saying this should be the new normal. And they're just sort of wishing away any bad outcomes as, if there's food shortages, well, it's because we waste so much food and we can just solve that with aid, as if countries becoming dependent on food aid is a good thing. It's shocking. And I think you've called it a lot of these people as Malthusian, and they really say, no, we're not. But the other article that really got my goat was one by David McDermott Hughes. And he was saying, basically, I think kind of acknowledging that we're not going to solve intermittency, or certainly not on any kind of time frame. So we should just embrace intermittency. And as someone whose baby was born premature and needed to be in an incubator for a month, I was just like enraged. And of course, he's like, no. Like, we'll preserve all the juice going to the hospitals and the vital services. And I'm like, well, what happens in Texas with no backup? And like, my hospital had the power cables interrupted by a road crew, and we were back on diesel. And with a total divestment from fossil fuels, we would have been fucked. Ventilators stop running, incubators stop running. I mean, these folks are delusional, and I mean that's a total example of Malthusianism in my mind.
And what an opportunity for nuclear. I mean, boy.
Yeah.
Now, I think we have to assume the nuclear scientific, technical, and industrial communities will naturally fuck up their opportunity to really seize the moment. They won't do anything, so we should not rely on them. It's up to people like you. It's up to people like Mark Nelson, Emmett Penny, Lee Phillips. I think it's up to the left in some ways. I say the left, not even the center left, because of course nuclear finds in a strange way for some people, but it finds more support among socialist left in many ways than among certainly the neoliberal left, like that you were just describing, Adam Tooze, or I would think a lot of the neoclassical economists would sort of be in the same place, where they actually say it's not coming from Malthusianism, it's coming from a really reductive view of how technology changes, which is they think through scarcity. So they think, they want to make energy more scarce. Now, they're not wrong in the sense that the price shocks that we're experiencing on energy right now, and gasoline, it's everything. And so when consumers feel it in gasoline, that's often what is it's gasoline and electricity, but that's often what drives change. It's not bad for nuclear. Now, we need to be out there explaining why we need to build out and why it needs to be done in the cheapest, safest, most efficient means possible. But this is the moment, right? I mean, la rêve possible. Like, we should be, the pro-nuclear movement ought to be more militant now than ever, louder, more aggressive, more angry. We should. I mean, this is bonkers. Like, people suffer and die when energy prices go up. Like, it's not, like, even if you don't have catastrophic blackouts, but even with blackouts, people did die. 200 to 700 people died in Texas from a blackout. So it's a serious issue, and we ought to be, the pro-nuclear movement ought to be taking advantage of it. I think in Germany, Brussels, I mean, I don't know if you saw, there's a major piece in Bloomberg on our comrades in Brussels that follows major pieces in German news media, including mainstream German news media, on pro-nuclear activists there. You see Macron stepping up. You see the Japanese prime minister is in his position to some large extent because he took a pro-nuclear position, and the parliament backed him. The Japanese
and labor and the unions supported him, and they typically vote more for the more left-wing parties.
We're starting to see labor. That's another trend we're seeing, right? Is that labor is staying up for nuclear. So big moment. I've been invited to talk to 3 major banks. 2 talks I've given. One is a talk in a different country. Talking to investors about nuclear. So something's definitely changed, and changing quickly, I think.
Emmett Penny talked about patronage relationships, right? And I mean, there is enormous resources being leveraged, between the environmental NGOs, elements within the Democratic Party. There's a patronage relationship there, right? Between renewables and the Democrats, and to some degree with natural gas to the Republicans, and then between renewables and natural gas. I thought that was such a cool insight. And when we think about, it's a David and Goliath struggle, right? I mean, I feel like I'm fighting this rearguard fight, to keep nuclear plants open, fighting off the environmentalists, which distracts me from what I'd really like to be doing, which is getting new stuff built. I'm fighting with the Canadian nuclear establishment over a vision that I think is horribly misguided. But labor is it. I've established some great relationships with the nuclear worker unions. We do have unions that are exclusively nuclear here in Canada. And again, I mean, they're just common sense people. And I think when you're talking about the left, it's this academic PMC left that they have no engineering discipline. They've never been in a factory. I was talking to an International Brotherhood of Electric Workers guy, and he was just like, of course solar is absolute garbage and can't deliver. And it's, made in China with, forced labor conditions and right. So, yeah. Labor's weak, because they've been crushed, but for me, it's not a patronage relationship per se, but again, I mean, your organization, other ones, we are on an absolute shoestring budget, and we're facing, I mean, you've done work on this. What's the sort of financial capital that the anti-nuclear environmental NGOs wield?
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out, in terms of what's the difference between the capital. Sometimes progressives, not Marx or true Marxists, but some progressives kind of go capital as though it's all the same thing. There's a difference between BlackRock money and boring pension money. The guys that work at BlackRock, think of the guys in The Big Short. The guys that work at BlackRock are guys who want to make ridiculous profits. They're looking for big profits. They're looking for ways to manipulate the political system to get market power. That's what those guys do. And it's political jobs in some ways. You can see why this was such a revolving door between those investment bankers and traders and others. But basically, that capital is impatient capital. It wants really high returns, and it's terrible for ratepayers. It's terrible for consumers. It's terrible for taxpayers. It's not in the public interest. It's in the interest of Wall Street. Pension fund capital is capital that you and I are having our pension funds, and that we hope to use in 30 years, or in my case, maybe much sooner than that, much sooner than you. But nonetheless, like it's old, it's 20, you kind of go to 20, 30 year investment. It's really a 30-year investment if that's exactly what it is. And so that's a really patient, you're like, in 30 years, I will own a small part of a nuclear plant that will be reliably generating electricity when prices are high and when prices are low, but it'll be really pretty well valued by the society. And so it's guaranteed. It's not going to it's not a tech stock. It's something really different. So the renewables guys, so we're overpaying for electricity really everywhere in the world where renewables have been deployed at scale, because there's so many guys like that are at the trough, making electricity more money and taking their piece.
Well, they love volatility. They love chaos, right? Because those are
right.
just opportunities to bring in massive profits.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just visiting the world's largest operating nuclear facility, which is right here in Ontario. And, I was there with a group of labor folks and people from the left-wing party in Canada, and one was a critic of infrastructure, I believe. And, he's very suspicious of public-private partnerships, which Bruce is. It's publicly owned, but privately operated and operated very well. I don't like private-public partnerships in healthcare, for instance, or, long-term care facilities. The mortality difference in the private places was absolutely bonkers compared to the publicly funded ones. But Bruce is, I was telling this guy, I'm like, this plant is 50% owned by, both a municipal workers pension fund and by actual union members. The Power Workers Union has a 3% stake in it. And many of the workers, have stock essentially in it. So it's very different. But I think that's a super interesting observation, this kind of patient, constructive capital versus this vulture capital, essentially.
And look I think we're in the midst of if I go further, I would say we're in the midst of a significant civilizational change right now, from fast thinking to slow thinking, from fast capital to slow capital. That's why I find a lot of the uranium investors that follow me on Twitter, sometimes I'm just like, you're wrong, like in your whole attitude towards this. I just kind of I don't think there's so many the private sector guys that I think are the people that true nuclear should be supportive of are the guys that are pension funds. It's boring. It's long term. These guys that are trying to get rich quick, who have a magic box to sell you, that should just flag concerns for anybody who cares about this technology.
I want to say it's also something that's good for labor. I know there's been some real critiques of pension funds investing in things that are profoundly anti-labor or anti-working class.
Right.
There's a Canadian teachers union that owns the water supply for a Brazilian city and is just milking, and it's horrible. And so I think like a values based, you want to talk about ESG investment, a workers' pension fund investing in a nuclear plant that hires thousands of workers and supports the supply chain of mostly unionized workers here in Canada. I mean, it's a real no-brainer.
Over really permanent. If you go, it's not just like 3 generations of a 80-year-old plant. It's really permanent. I mean, nuclear is immortal. Nuclear is the existence of humans on Earth. It's really will be with us for the long term. So, yeah, I think that that's a really important, characteristic of what it means to be being true to nuclear. What's true to nuclear is long term, slow thinking, boring capital, experienced workers. Human focused. Human factors. Every major nuclear accident, human factors. Every major increase in performance from 60% to 90% in terms of uptime for nuclear plants, human factors. So I think that, the movement that we need to build needs to be more truly humanistic. It's not just pro-human and sort of, we want energy for everybody, but it's like, no, like nuclear is people. Nuclear is people in communities for decades or hundreds of years. It's capital invested in those people and communities with the security provided by the society, in the same way that the society says you're going to have Social Security in the future, you're going to have Medicaid and Medicare in the future, that those are entitlements that are not going to go away. Same thing with nuclear, that nuclear should be a civilizational entitlement. It's how people should start to see it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, our CANDO refurbishment program is Canada's largest infrastructure project. I think it's $27 billion, 96% of which stay in country. And again, I mean, we're moving towards a lot of, first of a kind stuff where we've got a supply chain and tens of thousands of workers who are intimately familiar with CANDO because of these refurbishments. And you just think we need to be low risk and cautious. Usually I'm it's not my personality, but in terms of, what I've learned about nuclear builds and the kind of failings of the renaissance of the early 2000s, it seems like a no-brainer. And yet, folks from the establishment are like, you're nuts. And the labor unions are like, you're right. So
it comes right out of the physics of the plant. It comes right out of the physics of the energy that you need big, capital intensive. These are big infrastructure projects. So all of the fast, get rich quick, magic technology stuff is just completely anathema to the essence of the technology, to the physics of the technology.
What do you think about? Because again, I'm like looking for models within deregulated markets like the UK, which are not friendly to nuclear, where interest rates on Hinkley Point are outrageous. I forget if it's just 9% or 15%. I think 2/3 of the final cost of the plant is again that capital that's just rentier and extractive. But I
Right.
understand they introduced a new financing mechanism. Is that a throwback
Yeah.
to the way plants used to be financed? Like how
Yes.
significant is that?
Yes. There's no new, and there's no real new innovation other than maybe in their messaging, but it's basically the old ratepayer model where the more that ratepayers can own the project, the more secure the project is and the lower the cost of capital. So in some ways, this has been mystified, of course, by people who are anti-nuclear and went and basically formed an alliance with the neoliberal right and left to suggest that somehow that's a ripoff for ratepayers. Ratepayers owning more of the project and accepting more of the risk means they pay less for the capital, and that's something that we do for all sorts of for every infrastructure project that we have. That's how you de-risk those projects. And so what they did. So Hinkley Point C was more expensive than Sizewell C will be in Britain. The exact same plant, same workers building it. The difference is just that they have more security because they'll have built Hinkley Point C, and that makes the capital that much cheaper.
Let's pivot back to renewables a little bit. I was mentioning before that it's you're supposed to kiss the ring. I refuse to do that, and it led me to think a lot more beyond things I'd heard before around land footprint, and it's again brought me around more to those labor issues. Around where these things are made, intermittent energy and intermittent jobs of just throwing up panels and then going away. Like being in this nuclear community with intergenerational employment and most people unionized and thriving, flourishing community just really exposed that. I mean, in addition, this again global stilling thing, it just seems hugely significant. We think of hurricanes as extreme weather events, but this is in a sense an extreme weather event. 6 to 8 months of wind down 20%. Is this? It looks like we're getting a reevaluation of the role of nuclear in France and the UK and other countries. Do you think this is leading to a reevaluation of wind and solar, of intermittent power sources?
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, in some ways, the interest in my work has stemmed from my criticism of renewables as much, if not more, than my advocacy of nuclear. So if you just look at my YouTube talks, my most popular YouTube talk is Why Renewables Can't Save the Planet. It's at almost 3 million views now. So people they know there's problems with renewables. You see the problems being addressed and recognized at various levels within the industry, the renewables industry itself. You see, there's an article just in Reuters today, where they talk about how the right wing candidates are challenging the current president on this issue of too much wind and not enough nuclear, and so Macron is now suggesting that he's going to do less wind, in addition to doing more nuclear. So and by the way, giving lie to the claim that somehow we can just do it all. We'll have renewables and nuclear. It's like, wow, but yet isn't it interesting that every time heads of state of powerful countries they actually find they have to make a decision, whether you're going to add more wind and nuclear. It's not China or even much poorer countries where the growth of energy is happening at such a rate that, you can kind of colorably go, you need a mix. In developed economies more dramatically than others, you're making real choices about, are you going to go with a combination of gas and wind, or are you going to go with nuclear?
Mm-hmm. Tell me what you think about this, and I don't think I'm the only one thinking about this, but the sort of geopolitical implications of China flooding the market, and flooding the U.S., for instance, with solar panels and destabilizing the grid. Robert Bryce just published a piece that was looking at the frequency of grid anomalies. But if the U.S. follows this plan of let me just, my internet's given up on a second. Sorry, I froze for a second there. But if the U.S. follows through with this CEPP plan, which looks like it's fallen apart, but was going to 40% solar on the grid, that would have dramatic strategic impacts on the U.S.'s ability to be a thriving country. It seems like if I were China, that's what I'd want to do. And I'm not someone who wants to stoke whatsoever, conflict. I'm terrified of what could happen with Taiwan and the kind of increasing tensions in the Pacific, and maybe a World War III is less likely because of nuclear weapons. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on the broader sort of geopolitics of solar in particular?
Sure, and I should say I got us 10 more minutes, brother.
Okay,
so
cool.
I could do my 10. Yeah, look, I mean, it's this is nuclear's moment first and foremost because of the energy crisis, but we're also in a completely changing geopolitical environment related to the assertion of China of its naval power encircling Taiwan. You see that, my argument has been that nuclear weapons or the desire for nuclear weapons option has been the main way that nuclear technology has spread throughout the world. That is something that has been maybe one of the most controversial things I've said. However, it's completely supported by the evidence that that's why countries get nuclear, and it is continuing to happen that way. So it's interesting to me that this big $80 billion deal that France had with Australia to build nuclear submarines turned into a deal between Australia and the United States to get nuclear submarines. Okay, ostensibly unarmed, officially unarmed, at least at first, but just that decision to have them be powered by nuclear rather than, I'm assuming it was diesel, is massive. Of course, it caused a huge diplomatic conflict between France and the United States. But I think that's clear. And by the way, I saw it just from last year when Apocalypse Never came out. The treatment of me and my book shifted by, I think it's Murdoch owned, I'm not sure, but Sky News. Basically last year wanted to talk about climate alarmism. This year they want to talk about nuclear. There's been somebody within the society, whatever, the secret meetings that the rulers of Australia have. Somebody is like, what's that? Yeah, they're in the Mason lodges. Somebody figured out that they need to go nuclear in some way. So the media is pushing more for nuclear. The defense, and you kind of go, gosh, I'm sure that's just completely random and has nothing to do with the fact that China is basically asserting its nuclear naval power all over the Asia Pacific region. We know that a majority of people in South Korea want the bomb. We know the Japanese are just a few weeks away or at any moment from being able to have nuclear weapons. Look, our entire space program was really a kind of, civilian side to intercontinental ballistic missiles. You go to, I was like in Australia, I went to Argentina and I was like, wow, it's so interesting how the rocket program and the nuclear program are in the same administration. What a funny coincidence. And it's like, there's always a reason, well, this is advanced science. And so clearly this is the subject of my next book. My next book is, the fact that was so hot and so controversial that I said impolite things about nuclear weapons. Of course, it just made me more interested in it. And so it's going to be a big part of the next book. I believe the nuclear shield that the U.S. provides to Europe and Asia needs to change. I think Japan and South Korea need to get their own nuclear protection. I think that the shield needs to be split up. I think the evidence is overwhelming that Europe has been more secure with Britain and France nuclear armed. I think it'll be the same thing with the Asia Pacific region, particularly as it relates to China. It just creates more complexity, more actors for a nuclear armed nation like China to face off against. And yes, it'll be good for nuclear energy too. I think the fact that Japan knows that, look, Japan may need to lose an island before it actually gets the bomb. But I think once it does, those countries will become much more comfortable with having nuclear energy as its energy source. But
what do you mean by the main event?
Just mean the Chinese may take one of Japan's islands. And it may take that for Japan to finally know that it needs a nuclear weapon, for the United States to watch it happen.
Okay.
And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean these are kind of cringy things to hear, but it does have the ring of truth in it. And I do think
Not
the truth
cringy. I don't
is
think cringy is the right word, but yeah, scary.
right. Scary for sure. And for me, I think it really goes to show. I mean, there's in terms of the nuclear disarmament talks. I mean, we know geopolitically that no country that has no major power is gonna, especially a power like the U.S. or China that are in a rivalry, are gonna get rid of their weapons. That's just not gonna happen. And in terms of nuclear brinksmanship, it happens. When there is more political tension, and I think that's a huge motivator for trying to avoid conflict with China, or to strive for peace between nations. In terms of kind of diffusing the potential for these things. Whew. Let's partially because I'm trying to avoid the topic. Let's jump over to COP. I'm going next week. I'm not sure if you've ever been to a COP. My sense is this is probably just going to be a big charade. There's, Leonardo DiCaprio, and there's a blue zone, a green zone, and an informally platinum zone. But give me some of your thoughts about COP. What's likely to come out of it? If you have any interesting, funny anecdotes about it.
Well, I mean, I think the big point is that President Biden himself, hours before going to the climate talks in Scotland, said that they weren't going to result in anything. Already there's finger pointing. He's blaming the Chinese and the Russians. But of course, he couldn't pass climate legislation in the United States, so he came empty-handed. They couldn't even get the deal to ban new coal plant financing done. They changed that language. And much of the language is no different from what it was in 2015 when they negotiated the Paris Climate Agreement. So, according to the demands of climate activists, of alarmist climate activists, of apocalyptic climate activists, the UN climate talks are failing on their own terms. They're not actually getting nations to do what they want them to do. But how could they? I mean, no nation is going to decide to turn over its energy and food policy to foreign countries. We just talked about weapons, and I'll just say one other thing about it. This is exactly like the fantasy that the United Nations was going to get everybody in a room and get people to give up nuclear weapons. Nations are not going to handle questions of national security through the United Nations. This is a big blind spot for liberals. It comes right out of Rousseau and this whole liberal view that we're going to all hold hands and use reason and brotherly love to figure out how to save the world. It's an immature view. It needs to grow into Hobbesianism. So the whole premise of it that countries are going to come together and figure out how to change the most fundamental parts of their national security and national borders to a foreign body is just absurd. It always has been.
Well, I mean, in terms of nuclear proliferation, when you saw the U.S. and its global war on terror going, apeshit in the East, sorry, in the Middle East, the toppling of Gaddafi, the toppling of Saddam, the invasion of Iraq. It's not surprising that North Korea would be seeking nuclear weapons in that regard. I mean, it's a fucking horrible dystopia, but there's a rationale there, right? That's the only, real true way to save yourself from regime change. So it's kind of aggressive U.S. foreign policy that results in nuclear proliferation more than, not only U.S. but other countries as well, or just that phenomenon of putting your nose in other people's affairs of imperialism. I mean, I was just blown away by the hype around will North Korea, is it such a threat to the U.S.? I mean, this is not even though it's a really bizarre country, it's not a suicidal country. And that just further, I think, inflamed things and was, a driver of proliferation. So I just think that if you're seeking less nuclear weapons in the world or safety, that's where to put your effort is into sort of trying to bring some sanity to foreign policy and avoiding these adventures, these imperialist adventures. But yeah, interesting. In terms of, I guess, just sort of,
I'm with you on that.
Off.
I think imperialism is a loser. What most people don't realize is that imperialism is really actually terrible for the countries that are perpetrating it. It's not just bad for the countries that are victims of it, but it's bad for imperialism is what brings down empires, right? I mean, it's like a business. It's like businesses fail when they overextend, they get overextended. It's anything with people. We fail when we get overextended. So that's all that's why, and I think that there is a chance to move to a different world. I mean, look, nuclear, first and foremost, it's changed the world around what it's done for the implications for national security. And it's uncomfortable to talk about, but we have to talk about it because we now see that it has significant implications for what happens, not just in Asia Pacific, or with some submarine deal, as big as that submarine deal is, but really for kind of what the future of the United States and Western civilization are in the world. Are we actually competing for our model, or are we going to let it be turned over to this totalitarian, social ranking system that the Chinese are pioneering?
Yeah. All right, Michael, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you gave me an extra 10 minutes there. I appreciate that. There's so much more I'd like to cover with you. So I'll be in touch.
Well, how about if I come back sometime? I love doing this with you, man. It's really great to catch up. I always learn something.
Likewise. Okay, Michael. Thanks again,
Chris.
Thanks again for coming on Decouple. For people looking for your books, your Twitter, where do they go briefly? We'll post it in the show notes. But
so the books are Apocalypse Never and San Fransicko. Please buy them both and read them. They anybody that says that I cherry pick or like I don't give the full view, just read the books because it's all in there. Right. And I'm proud of the steel manning that goes on in those books. And and then on Twitter, Shellenberger MD.
It's so important to read people that you have some disagreements with. I think there's just such a temptation to kind of read within this very narrow confines of, ideas that feel right, that kind of don't provoke cognitive dissonance. So, I mean, there's some things in your work where I have my disagreements, but I think this kind of impulse to cancel culture is extraordinarily dangerous. So, I'll keep reading your stuff, Michael. Again, for a couple listeners. Yeah, please do like, review, leave a 5-star review, leave comments. We want to hear from you. And until next time, bye for now and take care.
See you, brother. Thanks, Chris. I got to jump.